Great. Well, so one of the first questions that I want to talk about here is basically the marketplace appears flooded. You go to the RSA CyberSecurity conference and it's just, it's vendor after vendor, vendor after vendor, product after product, idea after idea. Everybody looks great and has pens to give you and other squishy things. At the end of the day, there's this concept of vendor fatigue where companies are just don't know what to do or just don't want to deal with 5 different vendors. Where do you see this going in the future?
Well, I would say that things have come to a place where we need aggregators to come in and help us understand what vendors do. I was at RSA and walking the halls, and I barely remember anybody I met there, because of the number of people. And I think a kayak-like service is required to, identify the best solution that we need for a particular area. I also see the trend that vendors are taking on smaller and smaller problems and trying to solve them, which makes it very interesting, for a person who has to decide where to prioritize the dollars. We will have to embrace like 300 solutions to get what we need, and that becomes very difficult. Another trend that I have noticed is that most companies that get breached actually have, well, at least recently that got breached, actually have invested heavily in security, and they still got breached. So it's not like there are things missing, but there is a requirement to move the liability, at least from the company, to somebody else who can take it up. And most probably that's where modern new age insurance will play a role. Not the existing insurance companies that are out there, but new age insurance will definitely play a role out there.
So, I'd like to address the same question, and I mostly agree with you. In the last RSA, there were 3,500 cybersecurity companies. In 2018, about the same number. And we were fortunate enough, despite that, being a small company, as being identified having the most innovative product in all of RSA in 2018. 2019, again, we got the awards for one of the top 9 companies bringing cybersecurity products. Nevertheless, because of this entire reason of even having a very high efficacy product that addresses the advanced cyber attacks of the kinds that got through all the existing cybersecurity tools, we also understand the need for partners. So we formed partnerships with the companies that had the greatest visibility into these advanced attacks that really started in 2017. When they actually penetrated all the existing cybersecurity products, mainly because they don't even manifest themselves, don't look like a cyber attack until the execution begins. So with that, we were able to talk to Raytheon. I'm only going to address those that are publicly working with us. We're working virtually with every single major cybersecurity vendor because what we bring to the game is so differentiated. But Raytheon, which is the largest supplier of cybersecurity to the government, and General Dynamics, the second largest, we are working with both of them. We're also working with Schneider Electric, with Aviva, and with Tech Mahindra. Tech Mahindra has also played a huge role along the lines of what you're talking about, which is providing the services also alongside the capability. But I totally agree that partnerships have to become partnerships, and relationships with aggregators is an important part of how cybersecurity differentiation can manifest itself. Now, I do believe that the industry itself is changing as far as the compute environment and where the digital assets reside. And a data center today is like a cloud data center, and that's going to deform, whether it's on-prem or it is the public cloud. That's what data centers are going to look like. So the traffic that is moving in the north-south direction, which is towards the wide area network, will be going in one direction, but the stomach of the data center has become very large, and what runs in it is very ephemeral. It moves from one place in the hardware to another. So you do require far more sophisticated cybersecurity products for the applications that can track both the application and the workload. And in that regard, Gartner has come out on the 8th of April making recommendations that high-value digital assets are not safe unless deep memory cybersecurity is available. And that's what we bring to the game.
And if I could follow up on that point then, obviously it goes without saying, but I'm going to say it anyways, there is no one-size-fits-all remedy. Would that be fair to say?
Yep.
That is correct.
And so when you talk about deep memory, what is the impact of being able to protect deep memory as opposed to some other types of tools with regard to some of the attacks we've seen in recent years?
So some of the attacks that have occurred are denial of service attacks at a packet level. For that, you do need firewalls and next generation firewall capability. But once you take a look at the attacks that have occurred in critical infrastructure and some of the attacks like NotPetya, Havoc, Industroyer, and the most recent Triton attack that occurred on a very large oil and gas affair, a company that is the largest perhaps in the world, those attacks were deep memory attacks. Those attacks are ones that weaponize at runtime when the execution occurs in the processor. So that's where it comes in as data, so it looks completely benign as it is entering the network. And a network protection system cannot even identify it. It is not identifiable until it becomes machine code. So because that is the area which has been a blind spot for cybersecurity so far, that's where we are addressing it very effectively.
And Saikat, what Atiq had to say, there's a lot of technical information there, and there's a lot of stakeholders who are in the cybersecurity landscape at a company, at a potential customer, who you have to convince, the people that have the authority to bring on new products. How do you convey that type of information on this is the product you need and this is why, in a way that possibly an uninitiated CEO or general counsel can understand it?
It takes a lot of awareness building for the most part, but it also comes in with having a certain amount of credibility already built up. So what we typically do is we have a certain amount of budget for doing security related stuff, unless shit hits the fan, then all budgets open up. But if you look at it, one of the things that we do is when a new security challenge comes up, we look for a variety of solutions out there. And as Atiq mentioned, when something as well defined as this comes up at a lower level, it solves for things, and it is backed up by Raytheon and has articles from Gartner and things like that. It actually helps us get to a point that the solution is kind of there in terms of meeting our needs and addressing the security holes that exist out there. So with that groundwork in, it becomes easier. Now you have to just go in, present the case, and point them to the other people who are talking about it, the other credible people who are talking about it, and that kind of helps build the consensus out there to go ahead with the solution.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. That our credibility went up with the relationship with Schneider and Tech Mahindra and Raytheon and Aviva and all these companies, totally. And Gartner writing was very, very important for us. We do have a threat and attack simulator, which can enable people to very quickly see the vulnerabilities they have. So if you have high value digital content, you're going to eventually catch the attention of people who have advanced cyber attack capabilities.
And what do you mean by that?
The value of digital content is highest in the government, where it's a national existential level. Raytheon is protecting it. Why they were immediately wanting to take a look at us very quickly is because they already knew of the attacks that had been launched against these assets, and many of the assets had been compromised, exfiltrated. I mean, 20 years ago, China did not know how to make an airplane, and today they're making the J-20, which is comparable to the F-35. I mean, they didn't do it just by linear learning. So
total coincidence is my understanding.
Total coincidence. It also looks like the F-35. So nevertheless, this is telling you that if your digital assets have value, the people who covet them are going to come after them. Right now, we are in a trade dispute with China. We are using semiconductor supplies. We almost shut down their second largest communications company, ZTE, because we held back semiconductor supply to it. Guess what? Everybody in China is thinking at that top level of government of how do we become independent of the United States of America on semiconductor assets. If you have semiconductor assets that have high value IP, you will get attention of the highest and deepest attacks.
And so moving forward, what do you see the industry doing then? as far as the next level threat or staying ahead of that?
Well, the vulnerabilities have now extended to the processor. I mean, I bear some of the responsibility for some of the vulnerabilities that have entered into the processor, because that was the only way you could get architectural performance improvement, by actually guessing the direction of how software is going to execute. So you've heard of Spectre and Meltdown. Spectre and Meltdown is the tip of the iceberg. There are many processor vulnerabilities. I've been in that business for a large part of my life. So those vulnerabilities have not yet been exploited outside laboratories and universities, but they will be exploited. We are able to protect against those, and this becomes a very important domain, which is why we are able to work with even cybersecurity companies that have the largest array of cybersecurity tools themselves and have the largest and most recognizable names in the industry.
Yeah, when I think about it from my shoes as a security officer, the industry, I think, will respond with a variety of things. As I said, credibility and building day one, relationships in a way that whatever solution is brought in can be deployed without having to worry about false positives and things like that is going to be extremely important. I think we have seen a lot of disservice in the past by products that were half-baked, resulted in a lot of alarms without real issues being identified. And I think that's going to go away. That is going away. A lot of new products actually do that. And I see the startup ecosystem responding with even better solutions, which will qualify a particular incident and also provide a solution. And that solution would be extremely easy to deploy. It will be much more doable than this, theoretical stuff that we get today, where we have to spend hours and hours. In fact, one example that comes to mind is, and we were talking about this earlier, is that when a company gets attacked with a web access firewall in place, the problem is that the web access firewalls start throwing you alarms, and the alarms are at the highest when the attack is at its highest. And the natural response for security teams is to go in and turn off the alarm, because you can't deal with the amount of issues that you are being sent to address. So, and that's how those attacks get successful. So, and that's the problem we have to solve, and I think that's going to get solved relatively soon.
This is a huge problem that has been identified just now. Web application firewalls that are supposed to protect you produce so much noise, so many false positives, that at the very time when your vulnerability is greatest and they are an impediment in your operational efficiency, you turn them off. Now you're basically totally naked. You're telling the attacker, come get me. So in our particular case, we have near zero false positives. I use the word near so that I don't lose complete credibility, but we don't get false positives in reality.
I want to transition a little bit to the regulatory landscape that we're seeing now. A lot of companies who were not so aware, not companies, but folks at companies and in different industries who were probably not so aware of the impact of data privacy and data security laws got kind of a wake-up call earlier this year with the effective date of the GDPR. And around the corner here we have the California Consumer Protection Act coming online, with which it's backwards looking. And then you have federal government, at least in the United States, agencies becoming more clear, or at least not so clear in their guidance, but more clear as far as their expectations as far as cybersecurity and data protection. I cite, for example, the SEC's guidance in 2018, which was the first time in almost a decade that they had come out and publicly said something official about data protection, or at the very least, in the SEC's case, regulations with regard to making announcements about cybersecurity threats or actual incidents, and requiring companies, if not by rule, by implication, that there had to be lines of communication from the IT folks who discover an incident all the way up to the decision maker who has to decide whether or not this is a material event that needs disclosure. A lot of other agencies are getting involved in this at the state level and the federal level, and certainly internationally. Where do you see that affecting vendors in this space?
I see increased focus on issues that we will get from organizations like the SEC getting addressed. Case in point is the whole GDPR changes that came in because of the European regulation are going to be soon backed up with California law coming in place next year, and privacy is going to be the talk for the next few months. And what I will tell you is that there aren't too many good solutions in place today to address privacy-related use cases that have to be addressed.
What's missing?
Quite a few things. One is there is no easy way to provide a state of the land or state of the union privacy assertion for most solutions, and that's going to become important. So there has to be an easy way, maybe through an API call or something of that sort, for a third party to understand what privacy implications come in when you use a particular service. It's too difficult to go and read those terms and conditions or the privacy statements that are out there and identify what is changing and what's happening. So there has to be a more easy, systematic, and maybe an automagic way where one system can understand the privacy implications of another and connect to it with confidence. So there most probably will be some kind of tagging required, or maybe layers required, like a red, green, and yellow kind of a mechanism required that tells you that data is much more easier to work with on the sensitive data is much more easier to work with on this system because exposure is minimal. So it could be a green. If not, it could be a yellow or a red, depending on what can be done with the data that is shared in that service. But
this is very accurate. That the privacy protection that is coming in. Here is an example. There are 3,500 companies at RSA. There isn't a single company that's doing a very good job in protecting privacy. So there are still regimes in the whole array of cybersecurity operations where still there is a door open for new products to be developed. A new product to address this exact thing, which is how do you graduate various levels of privacy, this is wide open. This is wide open for a new company.
Or in the meantime, good counsel is all I'm going to say.
Or good counsel, indeed.
Say on that.
Definitely.
Well, and so we have a few minutes left here. As you think about different entrepreneurs and people who maybe are not as cyber sophisticated in this landscape, as folks are building up their companies, what advice would you give as far as what's the most important thing? And again, recognizing there's no one-size-fits-all remedy. One thing I would throw out, and this steps off of something you mentioned very early on to our panel, is cyber insurance. And what I have seen in my practice here is that so many times companies will buy a one-size-fits-all insurance policy. Yeah. And they're not taking the time to actually read the instructions or the policy exemptions to see whether it actually fits their practice. And an example I'll give is, had a client who was the victim of a business email compromise. They wired several $100,000 to China and weren't able to get it back. They had a cyber insurance policy. However, that cyber insurance policy did not cover contract employees, the exact people who are running the finance area of the company. It takes working with insurance vendors to see this is the reality of my company versus the reality of the policy. And I think a lot of people just, as you said, the insurance industry will be adopting that. But at the end of the day, there is no one-size-fits-all with regard to that. What are you seeing in this area?
I think there's a lot of startup action required in this particular space because insurance companies have the inherent disadvantage of trying to not embracing things like the one example that you gave, which they consider as high risk. And that mindset will always bring in policies which will not address, the actual deflection of liability when required. So the truth is, it's a different product. It's not like any other insurance product. Any other insurance product, like a property insurance product, has a limit and a time limit to when the exposure happens and the effect of the exposure. Cyber attacks can take years to put in place, and often exfiltrates data and other important information for many, many years before they're found. In some cases, as we may have noticed, it takes multiple different investigations to ascertain how big the exposure has been. Case in point, Yahoo. If you just look at how many times they had to go back and change the amount of exposure that they had from the incident is interesting. So cyber insurance will have to address this with some kind of philosophy, which is very different. And for that, historical data models have to be built. There has to be a certain amount of effort going in to identify the right underwriting model for this. It has to be a new age model, and it has to be backed with things like AI and other things to kind of keep the model abreast with the technology that it's trying to protect. And that's where I see a lot of startup action required. And my sense when I talk to startups today is that most people hear insurance and get worried. There have been some horror stories about insurance startups, but they get worried because the horror stories are about companies that were using the existing insurance model. And and I think the thing that we need is a change in the way you look at insurance and how we do insurance and how we deflect liability from people and companies into a product that we can all stand by.
So in the insurance industry, it's a business. So fundamentally, the insurance companies want to charge for offering the cyber insurance, but they want exclusions also, or excuses not to cover, or not to pay when the time comes. So there is a concept that, at least in the conferences that I have participated in, where insurance companies are asking, where is the dividing line of where the exclusion can apply? When is it a cyber crime? Mm-hmm. When is it a cyber espionage, when it is a cyber sabotage, and when it is a state of cyber war. So they're trying to get those boundaries defined, but it's not so easy to define the boundaries when you have foreign countries being involved in some of the cyber thefts.
Yeah, another trend I think that will come up in the insurance space, especially cyber insurance, is there will be a level of maybe securitization that would come in once we have enough insurance where we could kind of resell securities which are backed by cyber insurance models that we put in place. So I think there is a lot of action that's going to come up in this particular space.
Well, in the remaining moments here that we have, are there any other things in this area that you think people in the room should know? Is there something that we please?
So basically, I would say for anybody who is responsible for high-value digital assets, be concerned. If you're connected to the network, be very concerned about cybersecurity. This is not a minor matter anymore. This has become very serious. It's only a matter of time that you can become compromised. It does require the attention of the CEOs and the CIOs for sure, but of the entire corporation. It should not be taken lightly at all any longer.
I would agree. That's a great point you make. One other thing is that don't get overwhelmed with vendor speech. That is, be extremely focused about the objectives that you have to meet for your companies, be you a vendor or be you, a company that has to deal with cybersecurity. In fact, there is no vendor that doesn't have to deal with cybersecurity of its own. Because when we evaluate vendors for bringing into our ecosystem, they have to go through security due diligence and they have to meet security criteria as well. So having a level of awareness around what are the core issues and how data protection should work, how data security measures should work, some of the things that Atiq mentioned, how those kind of threats or blind spots could be addressed, helps you in both ways. One, protect your own enterprise, and two, bring value to your vendor ecosystem that you're part of.
And so a final comment for me is that as I've been going around and talking to various CISO groups as well as legal groups, there has been historically, it appears, and this is mostly on the attorney side because attorneys are, I think, willfully don't want to know anything about technology and are very, very resistant to change. But I think I try to get CISOs to understand, or the CIOs, that really the folks in the general counsel's office at companies or outside counsel may be one of their greatest assets. If they can get those folks understanding a little bit about threats, attorneys are more scared about risk than they are about technology. If you can get them on your side as far as trying to explain to them that there is a problem here that we might be liable for, there's the buzzword, ultimately, they could be your greatest asset because, or your greatest ally, because they may have, in some companies, greater access to the C-suite than possibly the tech folks do within the company. And so that's a bridge that we try to work on. I just got a sign that says end. So happy to chat afterwards if anybody has any questions, but otherwise, thank you, panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.